Oh, we're live.
Okay.
But it's okay that that's on tape. John Immel, why are we live?
Speaking of being...
Hold on a second.
Because it's 12:15.
Oh, then we're just now live.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll introduce John and do a little quickie commentary here. Greetings, everyone. John Immel is here in the flesh this year. Has 3 sessions for us. Susan has 1 more session. Thanks for those who are tuning in and watching. I just have a quick comment here before John comes up with his presentation, and then we'll be breaking around 1-ish or so, and we'll ramp things up again around 2 o'clock with John. And John will have 2 sessions in the afternoon, and Susan will have 1 more. So that's what we've got going. Once the sessions may be after dinner, we'll have to wait and see. I just want to do a quickie comment here. Thomas Littleton is an evangelist / pastor who's on my friend list with Facebook, and we agree with some of what both of us say. Okay, we don't agree on everything. Thomas, I think, is a pretty good guy. Has a good heart for the Lord and all this, that, and the other. So he's really on the, for lack of a better term, attack about what's going on in evangelicalism, Together for the Gospel, the Gospel Coalition, and their pushing of the, what is it, the LGBTQEF?
Numbers. X,
Yeah,
Y, Z,
I can't keep up with what all it understands. And then you might have heard a conversation we had when we had live about Josh Harris. And to tell you the truth, so much is happening and trending that reiterates and enforces what we've been saying for 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Usually 10 years?
That I can't even come up with it, or keep up with it, okay? So the whole Josh Harris thing, which is pretty mind-blowing, I haven't even had time to even write on it or comment on it. But Thomas posted this morning, and here's what Thomas says, and this is and John may want to comment on this further. Out of the blue, TGC interview article attempts to sound orthodox on LGBT after over a decade of pushing the false narrative. Mark Yarnhouse, and I don't even know who that is. Orientation Revoice. What do you think? So scroll down a little bit. The article that Thomas is referring to is From Gay to Gospel, the fascinating story of Becket Cook. So Thomas Little is like, what do you make out of this flip-flopping back and forth? One day they're orthodox on the subject, and the next day they're not. I would contend that that's not really the issue going on here. I think that if you got Al Mohler aside, he would say he would have a gospel view on one and then a separate gospel view for the other. But anyway, this Claudia Emerson comments, and I'll go ahead and use her name and put it up here because it was a public discourse, right? She says, I think it's because they are basically opportunists and will hitch their wagon to anyone or anything that brings them attention. Also, it brings a fluid type of theology, totally lacking in sound doctrine and biblical principles. So they can sway back and forth as they find it convenient to please the masses and maintain popularity. Just my thoughts. It's shameless, whatever SMH stands for.
Shaking my head.
Yeah, 4 likes, okay, and then if you go down, keep going down a little bit, Thomas said, well said, thanks, okay, go back up. Now, here's what I'm trying to encourage everybody to do, okay? Her statement's a good statement, okay? But it doesn't ask the question, why? Yeah, obviously that's what they're doing, but why? And the reason part of the reason I want to talk about this in lieu of introducing John is because I find myself going back continually, almost once a week, to the very first conference we had in 2012.
Yeah.
Okay? I constantly find, and one of these days we'll redo that conference, you know, which I've been pushing for 3 days or 3 years. And one of these days we're going to redo that conference and add Andy in there. Maybe even lie and say he was there in 2012. Who knows? Okay, so here's what I say. The point I want to make up. I said, right, because institutions must have money to survive, and the money comes from culture. Okay? This is why they long for the good old days when orthodoxy was enforced by the state, so that we can be orthodox. See, if you get Al Moore and all of these guys in their cigar smoke filled room, okay, they'll tell you, you know, we gotta do what we gotta do, you know. Some gospels, but you know, we've gotta survive. And if it wasn't for that damn Americanism, we could be Orthodox. Okay, in my book, this is what's going on. Okay, so, and then I add to that, any institution, unless advocated by the law, must eventually capitulate to culture. It has to. It's where the money comes from. Okay? Now, I understand why many people are not ready to swallow our positions on things. I'm happy for the people that we do have that follow the conference, which if you consider what we're teaching and what our positions in, I'm shocked and dismayed and thankful that as many people participate in our ministry as they do. Okay, I find the amount, though, you know, John Piper would shriek and run away in sheer terror over the smallity of the number. Okay, I think, you know, I'm happy with it. Okay, so anyway, here's what she says. Yes, institution is a good word. I usually use organization. We'll stop right there. Nothing's wrong with organization. Families should be organized, right? Okay? God's ecclesia is an organization. It is organized. So institution and organization, not the same thing. Definitely distinct and separate from the church, which is neither. Which bows to nobody or nothing, but our Almighty God will never capitulate to culture. Okay? So it's the old, our church isn't an institution, right?
Yeah.
Okay?
It's never us.
Right.
We're the good guys.
Our church isn't an institution, but listen, your church is an institution by virtue of the fact that it's a church.
Yeah.
Church and institution is like, you know, duck, bill, web feet, okay? It's an institution, okay? And that happened in like the 4th century. So I thought this was an interesting discourse, okay? We touched on this in a little bit in one of Andy's session, in which I think you were surprised to find out that the SBC is in league with the UN.
Yeah.
Okay, that doesn't surprise me at all, because Protestantism was created in a church state and for the express purpose of a church state, And in the same way you're driving down the road and seeing a duck waddle down the road, you can be certain the duck is waddling towards a body of water. And that's where the church has to go as well in order to survive. With that, John, thanks so much for coming, and I'll turn this over to you.
Hang on a second. Andy, would you be so kind and go to Paul's passing thoughts on this recent article? Are you getting my good side?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go down to, scroll down an hour, please.
Get there.
Okay.
We'll get there.
Older posts. There's a method to my madness. Bear with me 1 second.
He'll get there.
This is a little ad hoc. I didn't plan on this, but I thought it was a good idea to introduce here.
We're getting close.
There we go. So, TANC Conference Primer, guest writer John Immel. I wrote this article in 2013. It's a long one. I think it's 8,000 words, something like that. It was a long one. Highly recommend over the course of the day, if you want to follow along with what we're doing here. I'm going to make some reference to it later. But understanding the full context of what I'm going to say will help you a lot to understand the big picture that we're talking about here. Awesome. Thanks, Andy. Go ahead and fire up my slides. So, yes, I am John Immel. Most of you who are familiar with TANC know me. I have been here since 2012. And yes, Paul has asked me to redo my first TANC session like every year since. And the reality is I almost did it this year, but I was like, but then some things happened that I'll talk about. And I'm like, no, I gotta talk about this. So, pop quiz. What is socialism?
It's a system of government where there is some private ownership, but the government highly regulates it and is in control of and usually confiscates most of the wealth in an attempt to redistribute it fairly among everybody. But it does allow some private ownership.
So some private ownership with this place over here where government somehow redistributes what they take from the people, yeah?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Anything else? So first answer, pretty close to what I came up with. This is, you could do this Google search with the best of them. You're going to get this in the top 5 results. Some variation of what we're going to talk about here. A political economic theory of social organization, which advocates the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Another possibility is, the answer 2, a Marxist theory. Socialism is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. So, the reason I wanted you to see these things is because I think people tend to presume, is my hand too high? I think people tend to presume this is really what most people think of socialism. A compromise between capitalism and communism. That somehow it's kind of this middle state, and of course if you take Marx at his word, he thought that this would be a middle state. But I want you to understand that socialism concedes the fundamental premise that the community is really the holder of property. Generally, the community holds property, and that which means it owns you and your production. Now, it's absolute expression is communism. And unfortunately, far too many people think it is a compromise between capitalism and communism, when in actual fact, it is merely one minor stage prior to the full communist expression, which is basically the state, the community, owns absolutely everything.
John, by community, we really mean state, don't we?
Well, and this is exactly the problem with it, because the only way for the community to own it is to steal it. And the only way for them to steal it is to have force, which means they are acting as the state.
So the whole community things is kind of like, it makes it sound like an employee-owned company,
Right.
but it's really gets right down to state rule
Correct.
of every aspect of your life.
That is correct.
So the whole community thing is a socialist deceptive nuance.
We're going to talk about that very thing very shortly.
Okay.
That's
Because there
exactly
is
right.
no such thing as the people. It is this, even though the state is the people.
Right.
There's no such thing as community. There's no such thing as society.
Right.
That is correct.
It is the state.
And there's no such thing as the People's Republic of China.
No, there is no such thing. there is only Xi Jinping who is responsible for owning it all.
Right.
So, John, two things. I do need to put a disclaimer. I have a massive headache, so if I look just out of it and I'm slow today, it's because of that. So, just so you know. John, why in the world are you talking about socialism at a TANC conference? Well, here's why. This year's catalyst. Now, I have addressed the issues of socialism, communism in previous sessions. We talked about the rise of socialism in National Socialist Germany and the church's specific relationship to that rise, its specific commitment to it, because of the resistance of Jews who were basically capitalists who had money. This is a common theme and has been a historically dominant theme in Christianity. And it is rising, roaring to the forefront, and it's very scary. It's getting more scary. This year's catalyst came, it started with this Facebook post up here from Ta Burr. It's a sub-discussion on Facebook, examining Calvinism. I comment and read there on occasion. I'm going to talk about him here more in a minute. But of course, these are two very popular advocates, and why I deliberately picked her, AOC. Ms. Cortez is a true believer. She is a true socialist believer. And she is overtly advocating a socialist organization for America. But the one that's more insidious is our beloved former governor, John Kasich. He is frightening for a whole list of reasons, because he is a Republican advocating what amounts to a socialist perspective. Now let's talk about Ta Burr and his fundamental question here. I don't think you can see that right there, so I am going to read it. He asked this question: any idea why the top of the Gospel Coalition and the SBC denomination and the SBC seminaries are all, or almost all, if not all, Calvinist? They push a very unbiblical, left-leaning agenda into Christendom. I am wondering what it is in Calvinism that encourages this direction. I answered that question, and ultimately my answer got posted on Paul's Passing Thoughts. You can go out and read it. Once I wrote it, in retrospect, there are a lot of things I wish I had added, which is what inspired me to talk about it here. The next thing that happened that has me concerned, or has me very concerned, is, I don't know if you guys know it or not, I moved to Denver. One of the best moves I have ever made. Love Denver. Don't come. You won't want to go back. Denver's beautiful. And it's crazy because historically, particularly being in the West, you would think that Denver would be a very right-leaning, conservative state. Not so much. So, two things happened to me. I've been building my life there, and one of the things that I started doing relentlessly for my new business was networking. And I went to a networking event and the ostensible title of this networking event was business development. It was a guy who was basically in the business of, he was a business coach, he was selling individuals business coaching, and so forth. And I went, and I get into this meeting, and there are 60 some odd people there, big auditorium. And in the first 30 seconds of opening up, he says to me, or he says generally to the room, I want every Trump-loving, wall-loving MFer to get out. When he said it, I actually wasn't sure he was being serious. I couldn't understand. I thought it was a prelude to a joke, a bad one, but a joke. Where I was sitting, I'm 6'5", I'm a big guy. There was no way for me to politely get myself up and get out. That was my first introduction. Now, I might have decided that that was an aberration. I know, you're like, he said what? He did say that. He said exactly that, only he didn't abbreviate. And unfortunately, that wasn't the only time he said that. Within 15 minutes, I was full on notice that me, as a white male, I was not considered one of his target audience, and he didn't care. And he considered himself, he said this repeatedly, that he was a social justice warrior. How this actually goes into business development and business creation, I don't know. To this minute, I don't understand. Obviously, I didn't use this guy for my business development. I thought, well, okay, so maybe it's an aberration, and I'm going to other places, and I end up with, I go to this other group, and they're a group of heavy hitters. They were much more in my target audience. Their networking associations were much more closer in line with what I was looking for business development. And yet, I found them saying the exact same thing. They considered themselves social justice warriors. And over time, I realized that what they were really impressed with, what they were really interested in, is they were in love with their own philanthropy. And I was surprised at how often, now, they would have been, okay, they were all white, very upper middle class. And the thing that I found very curious was how often they felt the need to apologize for their wealth and to self-incriminate over their lack of social justice and why this was turning them into social justice warriors. And I happened to talk to a couple of them about what that meant. And what I was surprised at is how few of them really understood what social justice was, what its origins was, what it meant. And what socialism was, they tended to think it was, like I showed you previously, a compromise between communism and capitalism. It's kind of the benevolent version. Needless to say, actually no, I should probably point it out, I didn't join this group either. So then the question is, what is social justice?
Oh, well, let me give Plato's definition of social justice. Perhaps it'll be helpful. Social justice is obedience to whatever it's unity around the dictates of the state, no matter what that happens to be. Plato defines social justice as a unity around any given philosophy.
Okay.
Okay?
Go ahead. Andy, go ahead.
I'm going to wander around here just as I think out loud, but there is this idea, there's this utopian, to coin your phrase, within the realm of this idea of utopian prestige, there's an ideology that seeks equality, this notion of equality. Mm-hmm. But because individuals being who they are, certain individuals naturally are going to be better producers than others. Mm-hmm. So they want to somehow conflate production, or they want to somehow conflate this notion of human value and equality with production, or what you have or don't have. And so the fact that there are certain groups of people that are somehow perceived to have an advantage over others, that is an injustice. And so in an attempt to level the playing field, we have to make things just and level this playing field so that everybody has this notion of equality.
That's pretty good. Justice in terms of distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privilege within a society. The quote attached to this is, individuality gives way to the struggle for social justice. The subordination of the individual to the social collective. Social justice is a political and philosophical concept which holds that all people should be equal, all should have equal access to wealth, health, well-being, justice, and opportunity.
Fairness.
Fairness. The concept of social justice has often referred to the process of ensuring the individuals fulfill their roles in society and receive what is their due from society. Notice that the individual is subordinate to society and that other people are given their due. So this is exactly what Andy was saying, that individuals, in a quest for equality, individuals are redistributed, and it is their just right. It is their right to have these things in equal measure. I think culturally, the challenge that we have in America right this minute is far too many people refuse to understand the public policy that their good intentions are based in an unmitigated disaster. So here's the thing. The first guy, he was a true believer. The first business developer guy that I met out in Denver, the one that told me that Trump lover, wall lover people should get out. He was a true believer. He knew exactly what he was talking about. The thing that concerned me more than anything else was the second group, the second networking group. Because those people were very impressed with their own philanthropy. They thought they were being generous. And they thought that their sense of compassion for the underprivileged was a measure of their compassion. But what they failed to grasp is the practical application of the way they were framing the issue of their compassion. The second problem we have in America is our current thought leaders have failed to offer an unapologetic defense of individual liberty and its corollary capitalism. And this is crucial. Americans like to talk about being free, but if you say to them, defend for me capitalism, most of them can't do it. Here's another Denver story. So I moved to Denver, it's been about a year and a few months by now. And I am a political creature. I tend to follow politics. I tend to follow the names and faces of politics. But I was new to the Colorado political spectrum. I didn't know who the players were. I moved there 3 months before our last election cycle. And for 3 months, I could not distinguish the Democrat and Republican candidate for governor by any of the advertisements that I saw. And that's not uncommon just because just prior to an election, most of the kinds of advertisements that are on are usually some form of personal attack. And it wasn't until I heard the Democrat advocating basically his social justice policies that I understood who exactly was going to be the Democrat candidate. And the moment I realized that I couldn't tell the distinction between the Republican and Democrat candidate, and the Democrat candidate was an overt socialist Democrat of the Bernie Sanders ilk, I was furious. If you can't, as a Republican, differentiate yourself by defending capitalism fundamentally, how can you possibly hope to win an election in what is ostensibly a reasonably conservative state? Now, I actually ended up, I had some time, I ended up going downtown and the state capitol right there in Denver, and I ended up talking to one of the representatives that was there on Capitol Hill, or on their, right there in their governing center right there, I can't think of where it's at. And he started to tell me that the reason they lost the election was because people didn't like Trump. They thought Trump was mean, and so they decided to vote for this Democratic socialist. And I told him, I said, that's crazy. I said, your Republican candidate could not defend capitalism. He couldn't distinguish himself because he could not come out and successfully rebut democratic socialism. It didn't have anything to do with whether or not Trump is mean. It had everything to do with the fact that ideologically you're bankrupt. And this is exactly the second part of our issue here. Our current thought leaders have failed to unapologetically defend individual liberty. And individual liberty is the right to trade values without anybody else in that equation. I do not have a moral obligation to ask anybody else's opinion or permission to exchange values. And the work product that I have is mine. It's not yours, and you're not entitled to it. Which means it's corollary individual liberty. You can't get to freedom. You can't get to freedom without capitalism, which is effectively private property. My right to be free is directly related to my right to own my own stuff. So if I want to go home and play with my ball by myself, I can do that. The government doesn't have the right to take my stuff. And it's for this reason that I believe we are sitting in a very precarious place in American history. I have said this in many prior TANC conferences. You cannot abandon the principles that founded America and hope to keep the freedom, liberties, and prosperity that are the result. It's not possible. If these are our two fundamental issues, we refuse to understand and our thought leaders refuse to teach successfully, this is my comment to this fundamental problem. Be arrogant, be ignorant, arrogant if you must. If you can do it, okay, great. Be ignorant if you must. But I have no toleration for arrogance and ignorance. If you're a true believing social justice warrior, I can respect that. But what I can't respect is people who default or evade the realities behind these ideas. They are fundamentally destructive. In every instance that they have been initiated, they destroy the people, the society, the economy. Absolutely. I'm going to say something scandalous. Adults get the government they deserve. There are no victims in mass slaughter. There are no victims in the world's tyrannies. Either men absolve themselves of the responsibility to change the government that is perpetrating the tyranny, or they agreed with the premise that made the tyranny possible. They are either complacent or complicit. In the world of government force, you don't get credit for good intentions. You are judged by reality for your ignorance or your willful blindness. There is frankly no excuse for those heavy hitters in that snooty-faluty networking group for them to be ignorant of the implications of what they were advocating. Their determination to be social justice warriors had nothing to do with the militant rise of militant socialism that we're seeing in the United States. They were ignorant, and they were arrogant. Your judgment produces the government you deserve. And here's the problem with principles, and here is why the second networking group I found much more concerning. Actually, I was so concerned about, after I'd had my interaction, I actually called a friend and said, look dude, I don't know what to do. Because I've just moved here, I'm trying to build a business here, and if Colorado is going to effectively go the way of California, we need to get out now. The socialist movement in California has wrecked that state almost beyond recognition. And anytime I hear someone say that someone is deserving, someone who has not worked, has not produced, is somehow deserving of a better chance in life, and then therefore those who have better things have a moral obligation to give back, they've conceded the fundamental premise. The premise being that non-producers have just as much right to substance as the people who produced it. So if man is morally required to give a dime to the needs of others, it is morally required to give every dime to the needs of others. Any argument that concedes the premise is really an argument over how much. So I asked the initial question, what is socialism? And we got the answer being either what we were online, what I found online, and or what was discussed here, is somehow this modest progression between what we have in capitalism to full-on communism. When in actual fact, socialism concedes communist presumptions, the communist premise, that the needs of others, the primary issue is there is someone else's need, preempts anybody else's production. Yes, Andy?
Minimum wage.
Minimum wage.
I
Say
had
more.
this conversation with a customer just this past week. And, you know, of course, he thinks $15 an hour is a great idea. And I said, well, for one thing, you don't understand how to run a business. I said, you don't determine, wages are not determined by the value of the individual. Wages are determined by the value of the job, for one thing. Second of all, if there's, and then he throws in this, this, you know, the buzzword, this living wage idea. I was like, what does that even mean? What is a living wage, and who gets to decide that? I said, and then thirdly, if $15 an hour is so good, why stop at 15?
Right.
Why are you stopping at 15? You know, why not 20? Why not $30 an hour? Or like you said, why not give them everything?
Right. So, and that's exactly the premise of the minimum wage is, once you concede the premise of minimum wage, that all work should have a baseline of compensation, which is absurd because not all work is created equal. Once you concede that premise, and when I was young, minimum wage was what, $2.35, 50 cents, something like that? We're at $7 plus. Now we're having open discussions, political discussions, that minimum wage should be $15 or $20. But once you concede the premise of the argument, i.e., that human beings deserve the right to have money generally, independent of the actual value of the work, once you concede that, everything else is just a discussion of how much. Which is why the moment we start to talk about redistributing wealth, redistributing work capital, once you concede the premise that it's right to satisfy other people's needs, the conversation is only how much are we going to give. We start with a dime and we end up being responsible for every dime.
And what would stop, you know, inherent in the idiocy of it is the questions that arise not only why stop at $15 an hour, why stop with any given career?
Right?
Why is this push for minimum wage only a discussion about in the realm of the little people?
Right.
Okay. Aren't they therefore, isn't their work, whatever it is, whether flipping burgers at Burger King or anything else, the same value of that as a brain surgeon? What makes the brain surgeon better? And you can only hope it doesn't work because of what I hear nurse aides say. Oh, I mean, even hardcore liberal nurse aides will say, oh, so some guy standing at the French fryer at McDonald's makes what we make as a nurse aide? Really? Okay. You can only hope that happens enough to where it won't stand.
You can hope.
Right.
However, history shows that the exact opposite is true, and that's
Right.
what is so concerning. Any argument that concedes the premise is really a discussion over how much. And the problem, this is why compromise does not work. Communism is not a compromise with capitalism. Communism is the final penultimate moment of tyranny on the planet. Capitalism is the essence of freedom. There is no compromise. There's no a little bit of tyranny and a little bit of freedom. You have one or the other. And this is why, unfortunately, this is where we sit with our political and social and intellectual leaders. They refuse to defend liberty as such. They refuse to defend your right to dispose of your life as you choose. And unfortunately, in our modern age, one of the leading intellectual teachers of our culture is the church. Unfortunately, far too many people in the church think socialism equals a good idea. It's a good idea, just the right people haven't done it. It hasn't been done in the right place. We haven't gotten the right amount of money. And capitalism equals a necessary evil. Well, it's bad that we have individuals that are selfish and they do selfish things, but they make money, and that money makes it possible for everybody else to have stuff. I have said this in every TANC conference, I think, since the beginning. And I know some of you have already seen it, but repetition is the mother of learning. And this is the gospel according to John Immel, and it explains why we are seeing this happen again and again and again. All people act logically from their assumptions. It does not matter how inconsistent the ideas or insane the rationale, they will act until the logic is fulfilled. And therefore, when you see masses of people saying that taking the same destructive actions, find the assumptions, and you will find the cause. Now, I know Paul has been asking me to do my full presentation teaching on this. This is from 2012. But you guys, if you're uninitiated, you need to see this. So I'm going to give a brief discussion of what I told in full detail in 2012. This is my addition to world philosophy. I identified 5 elements of tyranny. You will find these elements, these arguments, in all forms of tyranny. I don't care what name it goes by. At the root, the founding ideas are these 5 elements: the abolition of ambition, universal guilt, dictated good, incompetent masses, and collective conformity. I put this in a web because I want you to understand these remain in dynamic tension. There's no one idea or one subset of arguments that stands in isolation and primary. They all play off of each other. But the beginning point for most, and actually Susan's discussion today and her address of the issues of the fall of man, the reason the doctrine of the fall of man in its origin is so crucial is because it lays the foundation for almost all of the subsequent church tyranny. If you can determine that everybody has a universal guilt, everybody is fundamentally immoral, everybody fell, everybody exists in an inferior state, ultimately what you have then is incompetent masses. Because of their nature, of their fundamental corruption, they really can't make good choices. And because they can't make good choices, where's my light?
Trigger.
Dictated good. We start out with a fundamental guilt, a fundamental existential guilt. Then we say we have, because of that existential guilt, we have incompetent masses. And because they're incompetent, because they won't do the right thing, because they won't give their money of their own accord, we need to have somebody who will compel them to give that money. And this all is in an effort to actually create this utopia. And in context to this discussion, it is a socialist utopia. You could put any utopian ideal there. The church utopian ideal. The Muslim utopian ideal. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they are all appealing to a moment in time where everything is somehow flawless and perfect. And if only we did these things, if we were compelled to do these things, we would achieve this utopian ideal. Unfortunately, that never happens. It never, ever happens. So to keep people in line, what you must do is you must destroy ambition. Ambition is merely the desire to improve yourself. That's all that means. It isn't evil, it isn't bad, it just isn't, it can be bad, it can be evil, but for the most part, the desire to get out of bed, go to work, make some money, create prosperity for yourself is ambition. That's good. But they must destroy it, because if you have individual ambition, if you have a desire to improve yourself, they can't keep you in line. Over here we have collective conformity. So most of the doctrines that are interrelated, that demand our social relationship, are here together. All of this goes together to create tyranny. Now, in my Gospel according to John Immel, 3:1 through 3, this really is the structure of our ideas and where we get our assumptions. The world of philosophy is broken down into 5 effective domains: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. We're not going to talk about aesthetics here. Aesthetics is art, and it is our expressions. At the end of the day, how do we express our deepest values? But most importantly, we're going to talk about ethics. Most people encounter, oh shoot, that's all I wanted to do. Most people encounter a philosophical system at the point of ethics. In other words, what we decide is right and wrong. And most of you think it is ethical to sacrifice for the greater good. And you accept that premise because you've been told forever that self-sacrifice is a moral ideal. But what that presumes, what that ethical assumption presumes, is that you have a flawed epistemology and that you have a flawed metaphysical existence. And therefore the nature of your foundational existence makes it require dictated good. And then, of course, the next step of ethics is how do we interact with other individuals. So we start with our metaphysical premise. This is what produces our epistemological understanding. This is what defines or shapes our ethics, and our ethics ultimately create our politics. So if you believe man is fundamentally incompetent here, that means he can't really think or know anything right here. That means he doesn't act morally here, which means he needs somebody in the seat of power to compel you to do the right thing. Susan, earlier today, what did she talk about? She talked about how Origins basically decided that the nature of your fallenness, the greater your fall, the more corrupt your physical form. And as you went through this stage of evolution back into righteousness, you returned to this ideal state. Well, that metaphysical assumption here is what determined that there should be a select few group of individuals that would rule over these corrupt masses, right? You see this process over and over and over. I can, within minutes of identifying somebody's politics, know what their ethics is, know what that implies about their epistemology, and what that means about their metaphysics. Once you understand that it's bidirectional, I can start anywhere on that evolution. I can do exactly what I said here. When you see masses of people taking the same destructive actions, find the assumptions and you will find the cause. Do you have a question?
What is particularly frustrating, and this is also true in the world of politics, and I don't mean politics as a philosophical discipline, but I mean politics in the realm of government control. What's particularly frustrating is when you're dealing with a political candidate who has contrary ethical values, or contrasting or contradictory ethical values, especially when they're claiming to be conservative.
Correct.
And all of a sudden they throw out an ethical value that is contrary. So they want to have both of these values at the same time, and you can't reconcile the two because they're coming from two diametrically opposed metaphysical assumptions.
You're correct. And in the world of philosophy, the most consistent expression of that philosophy wins. And this is why conservatives are failing mightily to make the successful case. They want everybody to think they're good people. So what do? They talk about social justice as if they are social justice people. And at the same time, like to pretend that they're also for individuals, prosperity, and capitalism. The problem is, the moment they concede the premise, the discussion is over how much. So what you really end up with is a political group that does not defend the very constituency, does not defend the very individuals that they say they represent. What ends up happening? We cascade farther and farther and farther down the path of collectivist disaster. That's a great point, Andy. So now, once you understand that metaphysics is the nature of our existence, how we know what we know is epistemology, how we value what we know is ethics, and how we interact with people is politics. Once you understand that as a progression, then it becomes very easy to understand how people define their own worldviews. We start with the metaphysical premise. You are a sinner. What does that imply about your epistemology? It is flawed. What does that mean? The ethical standard is you need to be compelled to do moral action. What does that require? That requires a dictatorial political power. Principle restated. Foundational assumption determines how effective man is at understanding the world, which defines his moral values, which prescribes government force. If you can understand this progression, you can unravel where people are and what they believe in minutes.
Faster than that.
Seconds? Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's amazing how fast that you can peg somebody right away once you understand that.
Yep.
The trick is trying to explain to others, because to them it seems like you've just made this leap, but they don't understand. It's like, it's taken me years to understand how this works, and it's like, but the more you do it, the better you get at it, and
Absolutely.
you can peg somebody almost instantaneously.
Yes, you can.
And then when you try to explain this to your family, friends, family, whatever, they're just like, dude, where'd that come from?
Yeah, that is a challenge. And that's why I am seriously hoping that more thought leaders will identify this, see this, and rip it off and expand it. Because once you can understand this, being able to successfully analyze what is happening in the United States right here, right now, becomes a trivial exercise. And it also explains what the answer to the puzzle is. Because if you actually decide, hey, man is in fact effective to understand his world, his mind is sound, his judgment is sound, then the moral values, the defense of that rational capacity is paramount, which means that the nature of government should be used specifically and directly in the defense of the individual in his life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And oh, by the way, that is the ethical premise underneath the Constitution, which is what made it so powerful. Be arrogant if you must, be ignorant if you must, but don't be arrogant and ignorant. Socialist utopias and the people who advocate socialist utopias in part, in minute measures, or in full, total social justice warrior efforts are destroying freedom. There is no compromise. It all ends up the same way, and its linchpin is altruism. And that is the fundamental ethical premise that you have a moral obligation to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. Now, those of you who have been listening to me for the last few years, I did a 2015, 2016, I addressed two primary issues, and one of them was altruism in detail. Now, the problem is that far too many people think that altruism is really compassion. It's another word for compassion. It is not. And in actual fact, altruism, the moment you presume that my primary ethical responsibility is to sacrifice myself, independent of any value, we're no longer talking about compassion. We're talking about destruction for the sake of destruction. And it is a crucial, crucial distinction. In actual fact, I cannot be compassionate unless it is my stuff to give freely. If I don't absolutely own the product of my life and the product of my work, I can't be compassionate. There is no such thing as another entity out here compelling me to give away what I have in the name of compassion. And it is a crucial, crucial distinction. The lever point that is being used to establish this socialist utopian dictatorship, it's not a utopia, the thing that is making that possible is the premise that you should be compelled by government force to make that happen. When you're being asked to be altruistic, you're being asked to sacrifice a value for the sake of itself. And this is the fundamental disaster that is on the horizon for America. My last year in Denver, and the social climate of Denver, mostly because a lot of the people that destroyed California, after they destroyed it, they decided to sell what they had in California and hightail it to the next best place, the best kept secret on the planet. That's what they did, and so they brought their disastrous politics with them.
Right.
And you couple that with the fact that in our current country, our intelligentsia, our thought leaders are largely church denominations, church leaders and church thinkers. The fact of the matter is that most people are still getting a steady diet of why socialism and social justice and all its various names are good. It is not. And we're going to now discuss, the rest of this conference is going to be used to address why Calvinism and Calvinist movements lean so far left. And my premise is that they don't lean left, and they are effectively the foundations of leftist ideology. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you, John. Totally looking forward to your other two talks and Susan's third talk, and everybody hightailed it either for the lunch or for the bathroom. But I want to go ahead and ask the question. In my fourth and last session last night, I point to one of these on your chart as the centrality to well-being and happiness.
Yeah.
Okay? And as far as child rearing, the one that we must emphasize in raising our children the most, okay? So, I'm not going to answer the question right now because I want to pose it to the peanut gallery, and they either hightailed it to the restroom or food. So I would ask you to pose the question for me at the beginning of your next session.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you.
Hey, dogs.
Time to eat.
Doggies.
I think one of these hound dogs needs a bath.
Both of them.
Yeah.
You're smelling like hound dogs.
Okay, give me 5 minutes.
That's on
and then
tape.
y'all can eat.
All right.
Air conditioner?
Oh,
Have you been following what's been going on with Gillette?
Oh, yeah, that. Talking about that advertisement they had.
Yeah, back in January, that the E2 toxic masculinity. Have you seen the latest?
Not the latest. The last I heard, their stocks were way down.
They lost the third quarter. They reported a loss $6 billion, and so they did a devaluation of $8 billion. And now they're coming out and saying that, well, now they're admitting that